So we have one of our longstanding listeners, Robert Dyson, who wants to ask you a question. So he's going to come online. Robert, glad to have you here.
Just a general comment first. I enjoyed reading the paper on the technological and financial barriers to scaling up PV. But in a way that tells me, I know that the US is very business focused, it's very enterprise focused, and I'm not against that, but it tells me that maybe the commercial model is inadequate. Don't you think we should move to production as in a wartime situation? Because eventually, or not too far away, we are facing a dire threat from climate change. So maybe we have to see it in that way. It's really like investment for the future. Yes, we have all to pay more now, effectively, to save in the future. Just another comment. You see, you were talking about storage. Yes, it is a problem with batteries. Again, because as Jeremy mentioned, there's a limit on how much material we can get. So for instance, I don't think there's enough lead on the planet to make enough lead acid batteries to store the energy which we'd like to store. But of course, you're just mentioning solar PV, but also we could have solar steam. So this is another way of doing it. And in this case, of course, you heat up some intermediate fluid, like some molten salt, during the day, and that stays hot for a long time, so it can continue to generate through steam turbines the electricity later. So there are also more solutions in that way. Another comment I have to make, of course, is that, I mean, people were very worried about nuclear power because of nuclear waste. But if we have a lot of, say, silicon solar cells, the doping agents can also be quite toxic. How are we going to cope with that toxicity? At some point, people will begin to say, oh, this is dangerous, yes, etc. And the other thing is, I think it was Mark Brown who said where the electrons come from. I was just going to say, of course, the electrons are there all the time. All we're trying to find is a source of energy that increases the energy of electrons in whatever, so that they can be used, you know, they can fall down the wire, so to speak, and give us back that energy. So the electrons are there all the time. So I think those are my main points. Yes, so, and I'm very enthused by Jeremy, actually. I think you're really the future. You give me hope for the future of humanity. So back to you.
Well, thank you, Robert, for your insightful comments. And that's very inspiring. I hope that we'll see what happens with the rest of my PhD. But to address a few of your comments, I absolutely think that the wartime model is the kind of attitude that we should bring to the climate crisis, because that's really the situation that we're in. We really need to do a lot more to increase our renewables energy production and displace carbon emissions. I think to connect that a bit more to some of the constraints that the solar market has, one thing that we saw in our study is that it seemed that debt was one of the variables in our model. And basically this means the amount of money that companies are allowed to take on that they could then use in their operations in production and also in building new factories. And what we saw is, maybe this will work. What we saw is that debt allows for the industry to grow much more quickly initially. I'm looking at this technological and financial barriers study again, and I'm looking at figure number 4. And so this yellow curve shows that, and these are 5 different scenarios. This blue one is high efficiency. This green one is lower costs. This red one is kind of a mishmash of some lower costs, but not that much lower, some efficiency increase, but not much higher. And this light blue is the current technology, basically. So what we saw at the bottom line is that debt was very useful in increasing the growth rate initially, and allowing companies to build factories more quickly because they had more money to do so. It was less effective at actually increasing demand for solar. Without changing technology at all, you reach a ceiling in terms of the number of customers that are willing to buy solar panels at a particular price. And so I think perhaps one model for, or one pathway for addressing the problem of, is industry going to do enough on its own with our current market structure to help with climate change? I think governments could do a lot more in terms of funding. Some different kind of funding structure, even if it's private, would also really help. And that would help us in sort of the next 5 to 10 year time horizon to really scale up our existing technology. But I do think that technology improvements do have to occur in the long run to 2030 and 2050 and beyond that, which hopefully gives us a little bit more time for current research to be commercialized. So I think that's kind of the model that I see that might be effective.
Great answer, Jeremy. Since we are now at the topic of, I mean, not just the kind of a warlike response, but generally the topic of what role does the government play in encouraging a shift in energy production and consumption? So can you tell us a little bit more about the policy landscape? Like who's doing what? What are the more interesting policy initiatives that are happening, and where do you see them going?
Yeah, so there's a couple things that I'll mention briefly. One is that I think most economists, when talking about climate change and carbon emissions reduction, always point to a price on carbon as being one of the most effective levers. And that's no different in solar technology. Having a price on carbon makes solar energy that much more attractive because it is low carbon in comparison to burning fossil fuels. And so that is something that could drastically change the landscape and drastically change demand for solar energy. But I think an additional way that policy changes could really play a role in helping the solar industry in particular are addressing some of the other costs in producing solar. And specifically, it costs about a little less than $1 per watt to make a solar module, basically like one of those big 3 by 5 foot panels that you actually put on the roof and connect together in strings. When we talk about solar, we typically don't talk about energy, we talk about power production, because the solar panel is basically constantly producing power when it's being irradiated. And so we talk about the cost for that amount of power production. So about $1 per watt is the cost to make a module. The installation cost to actually put that panel on a roof, to get all the permitting, to do the electrical contract work, costs around $2 per watt for utility and around $4 per watt for residential solar. So the majority of the costs in most cases are actually not making the solar module itself. It's the additional things, it's the additional permitting process, the labor of having someone install it into a roof, which is partially because solar panels are really heavy. And especially when we start talking about installing solar on a national or global scale, in this country we have 50 different states with 50 different permitting laws and different standards for code, and that can all be really complicated for customers especially to deal with, but companies themselves as well. And so one of the things that the Department of Energy is trying to do by 2020 is reduce those so-called soft costs. And so they have a number of projects and studies related to that. But that is definitely a very big thing. In comparison, Germany, a country like Germany, has been very successful at integrating solar. And one of the reasons is that they have national standards for all of these things. There's only one agency that you need to go to. There's only one set of standards. And so they can nationally legislate all of these, and it's much easier for companies and customers to deal with. So from the policy side of things, those are two areas in which we could do more.
Tell us a little bit more about sort of the upcoming technology. So you mentioned cadmium telluride technologies, right? So where are the improvements coming? Is it in the material used for photon capture? Is it in, converting that into steam? So tell us a little bit about where the excitement is these days.
Yeah, so I think most of the newer materials are improving primarily the cost of solar cells. So that's why these thin film technologies have been very popular in recent years. You see all these dots from, I think this is mostly for solar, these yellow-filled green dots. Copper, indium, gallium selenide, which is CIGS, has been another popular technology up until recently. If anybody remembers a small company called Cylindra, they were working on copper, indium, gallium selenide technology. And there are a bunch of reasons why that particular company didn't work, but the idea was the same as for cadmium telluride. They were looking at very thin material that absorbs the light, about 1 micrometer, which is 1/1,000,000th of a meter, compared to 200 micrometers for a typical silicon solar cell. So about 1/200th of the material thickness is needed to absorb the same amount of light, just due to the basic material properties of those two materials. And so that can really help in lowering production costs. So far, that has been really the main way in trying to get these more promising materials. But there have sometimes been these trade-offs with efficiency or with material availability. I guess another example is looking at this red category, this emerging PV category on the chart. Dye-sensitized cells, for example, which go back to around 1990, these red open circles. Dye-sensitized cells were some of the original organic photovoltaic cells, which uses organic components versus inorganic components. So a lot of sort of long polymer chains. And those are extremely inexpensive to produce. You can produce them with solution processing at really low temperatures. But the trade-off there is efficiencies haven't really gotten that high. They haven't broken 10% or so. And in addition, they're not very environmentally stable. Organic components can sometimes degrade under UV light or at high temperatures. The actual molecules can degrade into different components. So far, there hasn't really been a single technology to really hit those four of cost, efficiency, stability, and materials availability well enough to be sort of the shining star in the market. And time will tell in the next 5 or 10 years to see if a newer material might get there.
Cool. Couple of audience questions. One is from Walid in Egypt. Walid, thank you so much for joining us. He has a question, which is that Egypt is trying to build its first nuclear plant, while the United States is starting to shut down its nuclear plants and turning to renewable energy. So is it the end of nuclear power generation? And Jeremy, you want to address that? That's great. And I believe that our last week's presenter, Patrick's also online. So Patrick, if you're there, we might pull you in to duke it out with Jeremy about this.
Sure, I'll go first, I guess. I personally, and this is not, these are just my personal views. I think nuclear energy is important. I think that it is a way of reducing carbon emissions. It is a much different energy source than solar, in the sense that it is very centralized and is not distributable in the same way. And also because it has a lot of upfront costs, even more so than solar. And I think maybe in terms of the constraints of scaling up to climate change, one of the biggest barriers with nuclear plants today is that they take a long time to get online. Whereas you can build a solar factory in a year, 2 years. To my understanding, it takes much longer to build a nuclear plant. And so I think that's an important thing to realize. Although our nuclear capacity currently is much higher than solar capacity. And it may make sense for that to be a considerable source of energy, if not in the far future, to displace fossil fuels for the time being.
Okay, I'm going to channel a couple of other audience questions. So are there crowdfunding efforts that are making profound headway around the implementation of solar energy?
Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about crowdfunding, specific companies that are doing crowdfunding, but I definitely think it's an interesting idea. And I very much like the idea of using crowdfunding, particularly for customers for which solar may not be appropriate for their houses, who may not be homeowners, or for who may not live in areas sort of very regionally where solar makes sense for them, but still having the possibility of funding it. I think that's a really good idea, and those ideas are still sort of starting to be explored, not quite at a very large commercial level yet, but that there are some startup companies that are making headway there.
Patrick White just said, is crowdfunding the same as community solar? So in a way it is crowdfunding, right?
Yeah, I guess I see crowdfunding as very similar to community solar, yes. But Patrick, maybe you could specify.
Let me throw a wilder idea at you, which is that given that there's so much solar energy hitting the atmosphere, what's preventing us from putting in humongous solar installations in space and then beaming that down? Right? I mean, I've seen those kinds of ideas, but there must be some technical reason that it is not happening.
There might be, I've heard this idea before, and it's an interesting one, sort of from a sci-fi point of view, I think. I think there's two large issues that I see with it. One being that transferring energy through radiation, through light itself, is basically what you would have to do if you want to transfer energy from space back down to the ground. That is hard to do in large amounts. At least, I guess I envision having very high-powered laser beams shooting through the sky, and I guess hope the plane doesn't cross that laser beam. I'm not really sure. I think really the bigger constraint is solar panels, as I mentioned, are heavy. Right now, they require a lot of glass, a lot of aluminum to protect them because you want them to last 20, 30 years. And it costs a lot of money to lift things off the ground. SpaceX and NASA know this very well. And so it would be really, really expensive to have the kind of area of solar collection that we need in space. It would be orders and orders of magnitude more expensive than just finding areas on Earth itself. So those are my quick thoughts on that idea in particular. I think it is a cool one, just maybe not the most practical.
Okay, so we can have those sci-fi dreams, keep working at it, but maybe we can send people to Mars on solar-powered space. But before we do that, there's another question from Niharika. She says, was thinking in similar terms as Robert's solar steam model. We see that there's a lot of energy coming in, and why are we thinking about storing it? Can't we just put this energy into the processes which need lots of power at once? So basically, direct the energy that's coming in into what needs that energy.
Yeah, there definitely is a lot more today that we could do with solar. And certainly, storage is not stopping us today from integrating more solar energy into the grid. It's really only something we need to worry about as we're relying on solar for more than 30 to 50% of our energy. And we're not even close to that right now. That flow chart shows that we're less than 1% still. So in some sense, that's still an academic concern at the time being. Yeah, solar, so I work on solar photovoltaics. So I'm biased. I don't think about other forms of solar collection all that often, but solar thermal is certainly one way, and converting solar to steam is a good way of better integrating with current ways that we use energy. So one thing that you can do is you can convert solar energy to heat up water. And in fact, there are a lot of solar hot water heaters around. And that's a good way of making use of that energy. And a sort of more advanced form of that is using solar energy to, if anybody has seen pictures or in person of those large, sort of beautiful looking circular arrays of mirrors and a central tower. What that tower is doing is there is steam, a room full of steam at the top of that tower, or water at the top of that tower, and the mirrors are able to reflect up into it and heat up that water and generate steam. And that steam generates a turbine in a very similar way as happens in some fossil fuel plants. And you can generate energy that way. So that's also a good model. It's a little bit different in that it removes some of the advantages of PV in that it's less deployable. You can't really have a big steam tower in everyone's backyard. And you still need some infrastructure to distribute that energy somewhere else. But it is still a lower cost way of doing solar. So I think that is a good idea still. Just not really the focus of my personal work.
Okay, we're almost to the end of the hour, and I want to just mention one last question, I think, and then we'll wrap up, which is that, what are the big challenges or obstacles that you see that we need to address to really make solar power as successful as it should be? Or putting it another way, what couple of takeaways should we share with our friends and family tonight?
Yeah. I'll mention two things. I think the first thing is that the industry really needs to grow quickly. And because of the nature of the industry, because of the way that capitalism works, it's hard for solar companies to make tons of money because energy is a commodity. And so the industry needs help in some way. It needs a revolutionary technology, or it needs help from the government, or it needs help with longer time horizons in private financing models. It needs something. Our current business structure is not really supporting solar companies in the way that they need to be supported if we really are committed to reaching our climate targets. I think the second takeaway is that solar is an interesting example of, I think, a demonstration of how much we really care about impacting climate change in general. It's this technology that we have with huge promise. There's so much solar energy that we could take advantage of. And just imagining a world that's 100% powered by renewables would take a lot of sort of financing, and there's some concerns with developing our infrastructure, but we could definitely do it. We have done much bigger projects in the past. We have a huge network of roads across this country. Our existing electrical grid is really impressive. Don't get me started on things like the internet, for example. In terms of big projects, I think it's one that revitalizing our energy landscape to be more solar friendly, more renewable friendly, I think is one that we can technically do. It is really the political and social barriers that are stopping us from doing more. And it's the kind of things that relate to the policy mechanisms, like not having carbon pricing, not having a way of financing solar, and not creating an environment where solar will thrive on its own, or even with a little bit of help. That's the kind of environment that we need. And we all really need to be solar advocates and climate advocates in order to change that culture. And I think it penetrates a lot more of our lifestyle than we really realize. So that's sort of my, on the soapbox, second big takeaway.
Fantastic. So we are at 12:57. And I want to personally thank you, Jeremy, for this wonderful discussion and a topic that I think will be more and more important every coming year from now on, I think.
It's been my pleasure.
And if anybody in the audience, if you have further questions, please just mail them in and we'll see if Jeremy or someone else can address them on the website. So this is not the end of the conversation, it's just the beginning. We are very, very happy to continue this conversation series next week, except we will not have it at the regular time, we'll have it at an irregular time, and we'll be joined by Mara Freilich, who's also an MIT graduate student. And with that, I'm going to say bye from my side. It'll be Wednesday, November 2nd. Okay, so Wednesday, November 2nd, next 9 days from today is our next webinar. And we want to thank Jeremy once again for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mark, do you want to say anything or should we close?
No, I thought that was fantastic. Thank you very much, Jeremy. Really appreciate it. Great session. And thanks to everybody who joined us. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to write us. We're at ClimateX _team at mit.edu, or just post something to the web and we'll try to answer you. So thank you.
Or on Twitter at ClimateX _.
Great. So thanks to everybody.
Bye.